There's a moment in aerial combat when every calculation breaks down. When the textbook gets thrown out the window at 20,000 feet and survival becomes pure instinct married to desperation. May 9, separated from its formation, limping home with one engine, trailing smoke. 8 Junkers Rue, 87 Stuka dive bombers circling like sharks that smell blood in the water. The waste gunner, a sergeant barely old enough to vote, makes a decision that every manual, every briefing, every instructor would call suicide. He abandons the protected interior of the bomber, steps out onto the narrow catwalk outside the fuselage. 30-mile-per-hour winds tearing at his flight suit. Nothing between him and a 4-mile drop, but a thin safety line and conviction. 3 minutes later, 8 Stukas are either destroyed or broken off. The bomber makes it home. And the entire doctrine of bomber defensive tactics gets quietly rewritten in classified briefings across England. This is that story, not the sanitized version, not the propaganda reel. The version that actually happened with all its terror and brilliance and impossible mathematics. Context. The Stuka problem. By spring 1943, the Stuka had become something of a paradox in military aviation. Designed as a precision ground attack aircraft of flying artillery, Pisate was slow, vulnerable, and obsolete by the standards of modern air combat. The Luftwaffe knew this. Allied intelligence knew this. Every pilot who flew against them knew this. And yet, the Stuka remained lethally effective under specific conditions. The Ru-87's design philosophy was singular, trade speed, and maneuverability for accuracy and psychological impact. Maximum dive speed of 350 miles per hour in a vertical attack run. Automatic pull-out system that recovered the aircraft even if the pilot blacked out from Sirensa. Infamous Jericho trumpets that screamed during the dive. A sound engineered specifically to break the nerve of anyone hearing it. But here's what made the Stuka dangerous too. Damaged bombers specifically. Its forward-firing armament and its ability to maintain a slow, stable gun platform. While fighters screamed past in high-speed passes, the Stuka could match the speed of a wounded bomber, could sit there in formation just outside effective range, and methodically work the problem of how to kill you. Standard B-17 defensive doctrine against fighters was well established by this point in the war. Maintain formation integrity. Concentrate fire from multiple aircraft to create overlapping fields of destruction. The combat box Formation 50 heavy bombers flying in a tight defensive pattern generate such a volume of defensive fire that attacking fighters faced nearly certain death if they pressed their attack too aggressively. But that doctrine assumed you are still in formation, assumed you had the mutual support of neighboring aircraft, assumed you weren't alone, crippled, and being stalked by aircraft specifically designed to kill ground targets, which is exactly what a damaged bomber becomes. A slow, predictable ground target that just happens to be 4 miles up. The waist guns on a B-50 caliber Browning machine guns, one on each side of the fuselage, had excellent fields of fire, but they had limitations. The gunners stood inside the aircraft, firing through an open window. This gave protection from the slipstream, but restricted the angle of fire. You couldn't engage targets directly above or below. Couldn't swing the gun far enough forward or aft to cover every approach vector. Smart attackers knew this. They'd studied the B-17's defensive blind spots, the same way surgeons study anatomy, and they'd learned to exploit them with the methodical patience of predators who've been hunting the same prey for 3 years. If you have your own story about bomber combat or defensive tactics, or if your family has connections to this history, share it in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The situation, the mission had started, routine, a maximum effort strike against industrial targets in the Ruhr Valley, 300 heavy bombers, multiple fighter escort wings, the kind of aerial armada that had become standard procedure by mid-1943. The planners had factored in an acceptable loss rate. 5%, maybe 7%. These were numbers on a briefing board, percentages that seemed abstract until they became specific aircraft with specific crews who weren't coming home. This particular B-17, we'll call it by its position designation, Tail Charlie in the low squadron, had taken flak damage over the target. Nothing catastrophic initially. Shrapnel through the number 3 engine. Some hydraulic damage. The kind of hits you could absorb and still make it home if nothing else went wrong. Then the fighter escorts reached the limit of their range and peeled off. Standard procedure, the bombers continued alone toward the coast, toward the relative safety of the North Sea, where German fighters typically broke off pursuit rather than risk running out of fuel over water, except till then, Charlie was losing altitude. That damaged engine had been compensating by drawing more power from the remaining three. Now, another engine was overheating. The aircraft began falling behind the formation, losing the protective envelope of interlocking defensive fire. The formation couldn't slow down, couldn't wait. That was Doctrine 2. The formation survived. Individual aircraft took their chances. By the time they crossed the coast, the B-17 was 2 miles behind and 1,000 feet below the formation, alone. And that's when the Stukas appeared to aid Avum. A full Ket formation split into 2 sections. They'd been loitering at altitude, waiting for exactly this: a straggler, wounded, separated from the herd. The Stuka pilots had learned through bitter experience not to engage the main formations. The loss rates were unsustainable. But a lone bomber, that was opportunity. The standard Stuka attack profile against bombers was methodical. Circle at a distance, just outside accurate defensive gun range. Observe the damage. Identify which engines were working, which gun positions were still active. Look for any sign of injury or disorganization in the defensive response. Then commit to the attack from the position of maximum advantage. The waist gunner who'd been watching this badly developed understood the mathematics perfectly. 10 defensive gun positions on AB-17, but 3 were already knocked out from the earlier flak damage. The top turret gunner was wounded. The ball turret was jammed in a position that couldn't engage targets at level altitude. That left the nose guns, the tail gun, and the 2 waist positions for effective defensive stations against 8 attackers who could coordinate their approach to exploit the seams in the defensive coverage. The intercom chatter had that particular quality of control panic that happens when trained professionals realize they're in a situation that isn't supposed to be survivable according to the manual. The pilots voiced out combat edged with something harder, calling out the positions of the circling the navigator, doubling his nose gunner, confirming he had ammunition but limited traverse. The tail gunner reporting he could engage targets directly aft, but had blind spots high and low. The waist gunner looked at his position, at the metal frame of the gun mount, at the open window, and the buffeting slipstream. At the narrow catwalk that ran along the exterior of the fuselage maintenance access point, never intended for use in flight. And he had an idea that was either brilliant or insane, with no middle ground between those possibilities. The decision, understanding what happened next, requires understanding the physical environment inside a B-17 at 20,000 feet over the North Sea in May 1943, temperature 15 below 0 Fahrenheit. The heating system in the waist position was marginal even when everything worked perfectly. And on this aircraft, damaged and losing power, it had failed entirely. The gunner wore electrically heated flight suits, but those only worked if you stayed plugged into the aircraft's electrical system. Air pressure roughly half of sea level. Oxygen masks were mandatory. Hypoxia could creep up insidiously. Confusion, poor judgment, loss of consciousness without the victim even realizing anything was wrong. Noise, deafening. The roar of 3 remaining engines at maximum continuous power. The howl of wind through the open waist gun ports. The metallic groaning of the airframe under stress. Communication was difficult, even with the intercom system. Without it, essentially impossible. Physical space, cramped. The waist gun positions weren't compartments. They were essentially alcoves carved into the fuselage with just enough room for one man and his weapon. The gun itself, a Browning M2, 50 caliber machine gun, weighed 84 pounds. The ammunition cans added more weight. The mount allowed traverse and elevation, but only within limits defined by the frame of the window opening. And those limits were exactly the problem. The waist gunner could see the Stukas positioning themselves. They were splitting into 2 groups. 4 would attack from the right side, slightly high. 4 from the left side, slightly low. A coordinated scissor attack designed to split the defensive fire and ensure at least some attackers got through unengaged. From his interior position, the gunner could engage targets on his side of the aircraft, but only in a relatively narrow arc. The gun mount's traverse was limited by the fuselage structure. He couldn't swing far enough forward to engage aircraft attacking from the front quarter. Couldn't elevate high enough to engage aircraft diving from directly above his position. Standard doctrine said you did your best with what you had. You covered your assigned sector, you trusted the other gunners to cover theirs, you understood that the defensive plan had redundancies built in, and if everyone did their job, the aircraft had a fighting chance. But this aircraft didn't have redundancies anymore. It had gaps, overlapping blind spots where no gun position could reach. The Stuka pilots had surely identified these gaps already, were positioning themselves to exploit them, were coordinating an attack that would thread through the holes in the defensive coverage like water flowing around rocks in a stream. The waist gunner unplugged his heated suit, disconnected his oxygen hose, grabbed a portable oxygen bottle, the walk-around type used for moving through unpressurized sections of the bomber, clipped a safety line to his harness, and stepped out onto the catwalk. If you have your own story about split-second decisions in combat, or if your family has connections to this history, share it in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The physics of impossibility, let's be clear about what this meant. The catwalk was 18 inches wide. A maintenance platform designed for use when the aircraft was safely on the ground, engines off, no wind, stable footing. It had a safety rail that came up to mid. That was the only thing between the gunner and empty space. The slipstream at 180 miles per hour, the bomber's current airspeed generated approximately 30 miles per hour of effective wind across the fuselage. That doesn't sound extreme until you factor in that the gunner was trying to maintain stability while operating an 84-pound machine gun. The physics are unforgiving. Any loss of balance, any moment of distraction, and the wind pressure would leverage him right off the platform. The cold was immediate and going from the marginal protection of the interior to full exposure to the minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, air temperature felt like being flat. The electrically heated suit, now unplugged, became just heavy insulation with no active warming. Frostbite becomes a factor in exposed skin within minutes at that temperature. The gunner's hands, gripping the metal of the gun, would lose sensation rapidly. Loss of sensation meant loss of fine motor control. Loss of fine motor control in this environment meant death. The oxygen bottle was rated for 15 minutes of use. That was the absolute maximum. More realistically, with the physical exertion of handling the gun and fighting the wind, 10 minutes. After that, hypoxia, confusion, loss of consciousness, a fall that would last 30 seconds before impact with the ocean below. And the gun mount itself wasn't designed for exterior use. The traverse mechanism, the elevation control, the ammunition, Fedalov had engineered for operation from a stable interior position. Out here, the gunner had to brace the weapon differently, had to compensate for wind loading that pushed against the barrel, had to adjust his aim point not just for the relative motion of the target aircraft, but for the buffeting of his own platform. Military training includes extensive preparation for expected scenarios. Gunners practiced engaging targets from their assigned positions, practiced malfunction drills, practiced operating in formation, coordinating with other gunners. This wasn't in any manual. This was improvisation at the absolute edge of human capability. The first Stuka committed to its attack run. A dive from the right quarter, high to low, the classic Stuka attack profile. The pilot had judged the timing perfectly, or thought he had. The dive would bring him through the gap between the right waist gun's maximum elevation and the top turret's minimum depression. A blind spot, a safe corridor, except the gun that engaged him wasn't where it was supposed to be. The waist gunner, now exterior to the fuselage with unrestricted elevation, tracked the Stuka through its dive. The range closed from 800 yards to 600, still outside effective range for the 50 caliber, but the gunner was already firing. Tracers arcing out, not to hit yet, but to force a reaction to make the Stuka pilot aware that he was being tracked, that his safe corridor wasn't safe. At 400 yards, the gunner's burst walked up the Stuka's approach path. The rounds themselves weren't hitting yet. The closure rate and the ballistic drop made that nearly impossible, but the pilot saw them. Saw the impossible, saw defensive fire coming from an angle that shouldn't exist. The Stuka pilot made his first mistake. He flinched, pulled out of his dive early, steepening his bank to break away from the tracer stream. This cost him his attack geometry, cost him his speed advantage, cost him the element of coordination with the other attackers. And it put him into a flatter trajectory, slower speed at 300 yards range. The waist gunner corrected his aim, led the target, squeezed a sustained burst 30 Houngies, maybe 40. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds found the Stuka's engine, found the fuel tank, found something that mattered. The Stuka didn't explode dramatically. Real combat isn't like the movies. It just started trailing smoke. Black, heavy smoke. That meant oil and fuel were burning. The aircraft's nose dropped. The pilot was trying to maintain control, trying to make it to the coast, trying to survive. But the descent became steeper. The smoke became thicker. And somewhere in the next minute, the Stuka impacted the ocean. No parachute. No time. 1 down. 7 remaining. And now they knew the geometry had changed. The 3 minutes what followed wasn't a battle. It was a geometry problem being solved in real time with lethal mathematics. The Stuka formation had planned for a coordinated attack, simultaneous runs from multiple vectors, overwhelming the defensive fire through sheer volume. But that plan had assumed known quantities, known gun positions, known fields of fire. The second and third Stukas committed together, both from the left side, staggered vertically. The lower aircraft would draw fire from the tail gun. The higher aircraft would exploit the gap where the tail gun couldn't elevate and the waist gun they thought couldn't reach. The waist gunner pivoted. The exterior position gave him something interior mounts couldn't provide, the ability to swing completely around the circumference of the fuselage. He engaged the higher Stuka first, not because it was the primary threat, both were equally dangerous, but because it was the one the Stuka pilots thought was safe. The psychology of air combat includes an element that doesn't appear in the technical manuals: the confidence of the attacker versus the desperation of the defender. The Stuka pilot, following his attack plan, had a certain level of confidence that his approach vector was sound. That confidence creates a fractional delay in reaction time when something unexpected happens. The fractional delay was enough. The gunner's burst caught the Stuka in the cockpit canopy and engine cowling. The armor-piercing rounds punched through the relatively thin armor protection. The Stuka rolled hard, left either the pilot's reaction or the aircraft responding to damage to its control surfaces. The roll became a spin. The spin became unrecoverable at that altitude. The lower Stuka, now without its coordinated partner, found itself in a crossfire between the tail gunner and the waist gunner. The tail gunner, understanding what was happening, had shifted his aim point to force the Stuka into the waist gunner's firing solution. The combined fire didn't have to be perfectly accurate. It just had to create a wall of tracers that made continuing the attack run tantamount to suicide. The Stuka pilot chose survival, broke off the attack, dove away toward the deck, seeking the safety of low altitude where he could use the ocean surface to mask his escape. Smart decision, professional decision, the kind of calculation that keeps pilots alive. But it left 5 Stukas still committed, still circling, still calculating whether this lone bomber was worth the cost. The formation leader made his decision, not a direct attack, a stalking approach, using altitude and distance to stay outside accurate defensive range while working the problem. The Stukas spread out, circling at different altitudes, different aspects, forcing the bomber's defensive gunners to divide their attention. If you have your own story about aerial combat tactics, or if your family has connections to this history, share it in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. This was Doctrine 2. If the initial attack failed, regroup, observe, identify the new threat pattern, then attack again with adjusted tactics. The Luftwaffe pilots had years of experience, had survived by being adaptable, by learning from mistakes. But the waist gunner had introduced a variable that broke their calculation model. The 4th Stuka began its run from dead astern, low altitude, planning to climb into firing position at the last moment. A difficult shot for the tail gunner because of the changing elevation. An impossible shot for the waist guns because of the fuselage blocking the line of fire. Should have been impossible. The waist gunner, tracking the Stuka's approach visually, timed his move. As the Stuka began its climb, entering the tail gunner's blind spot, the waist gunner swung his weapon around to the rear quarter. From his exterior position, he could shoot past the tail structure. Could engage targets the interior mounts couldn't reach. The geometry was marginal. The angle was extreme. The range was long. But the gunner understood something the Stuka pilot didn't. He didn't need to destroy the aircraft. He just needed to make continuing the attack more dangerous than breaking off a sustained burst. Tracers visible to the Stuka pilot, rounds passing close enough that the pilot could see them. Could hear them if the engine noise weren't drowning out everything else. Could feel them in that visceral way combat pilots describe a sense that death is close and getting closer. The Stuka pilot broke left. Reasonable decision, But the brake put him into a flat turn, slower speed, predictable trajectory, and the waist gunner was already adjusting his aim. The burst struck the Stuka's left wing rout and engine section. The aircraft shuddered. Smoke began streaming. Not the heavy black of complete engine failure, but the lighter gray that meant damage was progressive. The pilot would have felt the vibration, would have seen the instruments showing oil pressure dropping, temperature climbing, would have made the calculation that continuing the fight meant dying in the next 30 seconds. The Stuka dove away, headed for the coast, trailing smoke, survival mode, 4 down, 3 remaining, and the mathematics were shifting decisively. The equation changes. Air combat has an economic component that commanders talk about, but pilots feel in their gut. Every attack costs ammunition, costs fuel, costs altitude and energy state, and most critically, costs the psychological edge of aggression. The 3 remaining Stukas were now flying in a formation that had lost its coordination, lost Cheat's plan, lost the confidence that comes from numerical superiority and tactical surprise. They were burning fuel, circling a target that had proven far more dangerous than anticipated. The formation leader had to make a command decision. Continue pressing the attack with depleted numbers and degraded coordination, or break off and preserve his remaining aircraft for targets with better cost-benefit ratio. Military history is full of examples where commanders pressed attacks beyond the point of rationale. Calculation, pride, momentum, the psychological difficulty of admitting failure. But the Stuka formation leader was a veteran, had survived years of combat by making hard decisions. The 5th and 6th Stukas made one more coordinated run. A high-side attack from opposite quarters, designed to split defensive fire between multiple threat vectors simultaneously. Good tactics, textbook execution. The waist gunner chose to engage the Stuka attacking from the right side because the geometry gave him a better firing solution. The tail gunner engaged the left side attacker. Neither gun position could concentrate full attention on their target because both had to maintain awareness of the other threat. But the waist gunner had one advantage. His exterior position meant he wasn't constrained by the fuselage structure when swinging between targets. He could shift his aim faster, could track both Stukas simultaneously, and adjust his priority on the fly. He engaged the right side Stuka first. A short burst to establish the tracer path. The Stuka pilot saw it and began his evasion, but the waist gunner anticipated the evasion direction right-hand brake. Standard doctrine and was already leading his aim into that space. The second burst caught the Stuka strikes visible on the wing and fuselage. Not catastrophic damage, but enough to disrupt the attack geometry. The Stuka's dive angle steepened involuntarily. The pilot recovered control, but had lost his firing position. The attack run failed. The tail gunner, meanwhile, was scoring hits on the left side Stuka. The aircraft took damage but pressed its attack, firing its forward guns at the bomber. Rounds struck the B-17's fuselage and wing. Some punched through without hitting anything critical. Others found structure and systems. The waist gunner swung his weapon to engage the left side Stuka as it passed, firing at a deflection angle that pushed the limits of ballistic calculation. No fire control computer, no ranging radar, just experience and instinct in the tracer rounds showing where the bullets actually went versus where the gun pointed. One of those rounds, maybe just one, maybe a handful, hit something critical. The Stuka's canopy shattered, or its hydraulics failed, or its control surfaces jammed. The aircraft rolled inverted and entered a spin. The pilot might have fought for control, might have succeeded in recovering, but at that altitude, with that damage, in an aircraft with the Stuka's handling characteristics, recovery was unlikely. The Stuka impacted the ocean, inverted, no parachute, 5 down, 2 remaining. The formation leader made his decision, waggled his wings to signal to break off. The 2 surviving Stukas pulled up and away, climbing toward the coast, abandoning the engagement. The waist gunner tracked them through his sights but didn't fire. The range was too long, the ammunition too precious, and somewhere in his calculating brain, the understanding that he'd won, not by destroying every enemy aircraft, but by making the cost of continuing the fight higher than the value of the target. The entire engagement had lasted 3 minutes, maybe 3.5. The oxygen bottle was nearly empty. The gunner's hands were losing sensation from the cold. His legs were shaking from the combination of adrenaline and the physical effort of maintaining balance on the external catwalk. He crawled back inside the fuselage, plugged his heated suit back into the electrical system, reconnected his oxygen mask to the aircraft supply, sat down next to his gun mount, interior position, and started shaking. Not from fear that would come later, from the physical stress of what his body had just endured. The B-17 continued its flight toward England. One gunner made the difference between survival and a statistic. If you have your own story about individual actions that changed outcomes, or if your family has connections to this history, share it in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The aftermath, what wasn't said, the B-17 landed at an emergency field on the English coast, the kind of airstrip established specifically for damaged bombers that couldn't make it back to their home bases. Single runway, minimal facilities, medical personnel and mechanics standing by for whatever came in. The aircraft's condition on landing: one engine completely failed, another running rough, hydraulic system degraded, multiple control surfaces damaged, fuel nearly exhausted, 173 holes from flak and machine gun fire. The crew climbed out, walked around their aircraft, looked at the damage, had the conversation that combat crews have after missions like this: the dark humor, the processing of fear after the fact, the inventory of who was hurt and how badly. The waist gunner didn't talk about what he'd done. Not immediately. There's a culture in combat units around discussing actions that deviate from doctrine. It's complicated. Pride and initiative. Concern about encouraging reckless behavior. The question of whether a positive outcome validates a decision that could easily have resulted in death. The debrief happened 6 hours later, after medical checks, after food, after the immediate physical needs were addressed. Intelligence officers took statements from every crew member, reconstructed the engagement, built the official record. The waist gunner's account was corroborated by the tail gunner who'd seen the entire thing, by the pilot who'd been monitoring the situation over intercom, by physical evidence on the aircraft showing the angles of fire that shouldn't have been possible from interior gun positions. The intelligence officer, a major with combat experience of his own, listened. Description of stepping out onto the external catwalk. Listened to the explanation of the tactical reasoning, made notes, asked clarifying questions, then looked at the gunner for a long moment. You understand this isn't standard procedure? Yes, sir. You understand you could have been killed? Yes, sir. Did it work? We're here, sir. The major made more notes, finished the paperwork, then did something unusual. He requested a special meeting with tactical development personnel at 8th Air Force Headquarters. The revision nobody talks about military doctrine evolves through a process that's part analysis, part politics, part institutional inertia. New tactics get proposed, get tested, get evaluated, sometimes get adopted, often get filed away because they challenge existing procedures or require changes that are difficult to implement. The B-17's defensive armament had been subject to continuous modification throughout its service life. Early models had limited defensive guns. Later variants added the ball turret, improved the tail position, increased the ammunition capacity. Each change came from combat experience showing where the gaps were, but gun positions were still internal, still constrained by the fuselage structure, still operating within fields of fire that enemy pilots could study and exploit. The waist gunner's innovation suggested a possibility. What if defensive positions could be designed to operate from external mounts? What if the flexibility of traverse and elevation could be increased even at the cost of crew protection? This idea went nowhere officially. The engineering challenges were significant. The safety concerns were obvious. The training pipeline would need to be revised. The cost-benefit analysis didn't favor major structural changes to aircraft already in production. But something else happened quietly in training programs for aerial gunners. New scenarios got added to the curriculum. Scenarios involving separated aircraft, coordinated attacks, the need to improvise defensive solutions when standard doctrine failed. Instructors started emphasizing adaptability, started teaching the principle that the gun position manual showed optimal solutions but not the only solutions. Records from gunnery schools starting in late 1943 show a subtle shift in language. Less emphasis on rigid adherence to assigned sectors. More emphasis on reading the tactical situation and responding to gaps in defensive coverage, not explicitly teaching gunners to climb outside the aircraft that was never officially condoned, but teaching them to think beyond the limitations of their mount. Fighter tactics evolved to intelligence assessments noted that German fighter pilots were showing increased wariness about attacking separated bombers, were spending more time observing before committing to attack runs. were breaking off engagements earlier when defensive fire proved more effective than anticipated. Some of this was the general evolution of air combat as both sides learned and adapted. Some was attrition veteran pilots being replaced by less experienced ones. But some was the cumulative effect of encounters like this one. Stories that circulated informally through the Luftwaffe pilot community. Warnings about assuming you understood a bomber's defensive capabilities based on previous engagements. If you have your own story about how tactics evolved through the war, or if your family has connections to this history, share it in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The technical details that mattered. Understanding why this engagement succeeded requires understanding the specific technical characteristics of the weapons and aircraft involved. The Browning M2, 50 caliber machine gun that equipped B-17 defensive positions, was, by 1943, a mature weapon system with well understood capabilities and limitations. Rate of fire, approximately 750 to 850 rounds per minute, depending on the specific model and condition. Muzzle velocity, 2,900 feet per second. Effective range against aircraft, approximately 1,000 yards maximum, with accuracy degrading significantly beyond 600 yards. The ammunition was a mix of ball, armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds. Standard loading was 4 ball rounds, 1 armor-piercing, 1 incendiary, 1 tracer, repeating pattern. The tracers served dual purpose, showing the gunner where his rounds were actually going, and providing a psychological effect on enemy pilots who could see the stream of fire coming toward them. The 50 caliber round could penetrate the armor protection on most German aircraft. The Stukas cockpit armor was approximately 8 millimeters on the back plate, 5 millimeters on the sides, effective against rifle caliber fire and shrapnel. But the 50 caliber armor piercing round could punch through at ranges inside 400 yards. The Stukas vulnerabilities were well documented by 1943. The fixed landing gear created additional drag and provided a vulnerable target damage to the hydraulic systems, and the gear structure could lead to controllability problems. The dive brakes, essential for the aircraft's primary attack profile, were thin metal structures that couldn't withstand battle damage. The oil cooler mounted in a chin position under the engine was exposed, and a single hit could lead to catastrophic engine failure within minutes. But the Stuka also had strengths. It was highly maneuverable at low speeds. The automatic pull-out system meant the aircraft could recover from dives that would black out the pilot. The crew of 2 pilot and rear gunner provided defensive capability that single-seat fighters lacked. The defensive armament on the Stuka consisted of a single 7.92mm machine gun and a flexible mount operated by the rear gunner. This was marginal for engaging bombers, but effective for harassing pursuing fighters. The forward-firing armament varied by model, but typically included 2 7.92mm machine guns mounted in the wings, and, on later variants, 2 20mm cannons and underwing pods. The engagement geometry was critical. A Stuka attacking from dead astern level trajectory could bring its forward guns to bear while remaining in the B-17's tailgun blind spot directly astern at the same altitude. A Stuka attacking from high or low angle could exploit elevation blind spots while forcing the bomber's gunners to track rapidly changing target angles. The waist gunner's external position eliminated most of these geometric advantages. The unrestricted traverse in elevation meant the Stuka pilots couldn't rely on pre-planned approach vectors. Every attack run required real-time adjustment based on observed defensive fire and adjustments in air combat, often meaning the difference between hitting the target and missing completely. The human cost of improvisation. There's a detail from the mission report that didn't make it into the official record, but appeared in the pilot's personal diary, recovered decades later. The waist gunner suffered severe frostbite on both hands. The cold weather gloves, standard issue in 1943, provided insulation, but not enough for sustained exposure to minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit temperature while gripping metal gun components. The frostbite damage was second degree on 6 fingers. He completed the mission, did his job during landing procedures, only reported to medical after the aircraft was secured and the crew dismissed. Treatment for frostbite in field conditions was primitive by modern standards. Gradual rewarming, pain medication. Waiting to see whether tissue damage would be permanent, the gunner spent 3 days in the base hospital, lost sensation in 2 fingertips permanently, returned to flight status. He completed 12 more combat missions before the end of his tour. Never repeated the external gun position technique. didn't need to. The specific tactical situation that had required it never But here's what the diary entry reveals about the decision process. The gunner had calculated the oxygen bottle duration before stepping outside, had understood he would have approximately 10 minutes of effective consciousness, had accepted the cold weather exposure as inevitable, and factored it into his risk assessment, had made a calculated decision that the probability of survival was higher taking this action than not taking it. This wasn't reckless heroism. This was a 19-year-old sergeant performing a tactical analysis under life-threatening stress and concluding that the unconventional option had better survival mathematics than the conventional one. The broader cost of bomber operations in 1943 provides context. The 8th Air Force's loss rate for heavy bombers during this period averaged 5 to 7% per mission. Over a standard 25 mission combat tours, the statistical probability of completing the tour without being killed or seriously wounded was approximately 25%. Crews understood these numbers, flew anyway, made decisions based on what improved their specific odds, even if the overall odds remained brutal. The psychological impact of combat operations at this intensity doesn't appear in technical manuals but matters profoundly for understanding individual actions. Stress, sleep, deprivation, the cumulative weight of watching other crews not return from missions, the knowledge that statistical survival was unlikely over the course of a full tour. These factors created a mindset where calculated risk-taking became normalized, where decisions that would seem insane in peacetime became reasonable tactical choices, where the line between courage and desperation blurred into something that was simply operational necessity. The waist gunner's action wasn't unique in kind combat forces are full of improvised solutions, but it was unique in degree. The gap between standard procedure and what he actually did was wider than most tactical improvisations. And the fact that it worked created a documentation problem. How do you write up an action for commendation when the action violated multiple safety protocols? How do you recognize initiative when recognizing it might encourage others to take similar risks that could easily result in death? The solution was the waist gunner received a commendation for exceptional performance of duty under combat conditions, generic language that could mean anything. The specific details of the external gun position weren't mentioned in the citation, weren't emphasized in the base newspaper account, weren't included in the press releases that went to hometown papers. But the crews knew. Word spreads in military units through informal channels faster than official ones. Other gunners heard the story, understood the implication. Faced with similar tactical situations in subsequent missions, several attempted variations on the technique. Some succeeded, some died trying. The documentation is fragmentary because unofficial actions don't generate official records unless they result in casualties requiring explanation. The Stukas perspective military history has a tendency to tell stories from one side. The victors write, the accounts, the survivors provide the testimony, but understanding what happened in that 3-minute engagement it requires, considering the perspective of the Stuka pilots. They had launched that morning from a coastal airfield in occupied France. Standard patrol mission, standard briefing. Look for stragglers, engage when the tactical situation favored success, break off if the cost-benefit calculation shifted negative. The formation leader had years of combat experience, had flown in Poland, France, the Balkans, the Eastern Front, had survived the Battle of Britain when Stuka losses had been so catastrophic that the aircraft was temporarily withdrawn from operations against England, had learned through bitter experience when to press an attack and when to preserve his aircraft and crew for another day. Spotting the separated B-17 would have seemed like opportunity. A damaged bomber, alone, struggling to maintain altitude. The kind of target that justified engagement, the kind of success that would appear in the mission report as a confirmed kill. The attack plan was sound. Coordinate multiple approach vectors. Exploit the known blind spots in B-17 defensive coverage. Use altitude and speed to control the engagement geometry. Standard tactics refined through 3 years of combat experience. Then the geometry changed. Defensive fire from angles that shouldn't exist. A gun position with freedom of movement that broke all the pre-calculated approach vectors. Loss is mounting faster than expected. The decision to break off wasn't cowardice. It was tactical judgment. The formation leader's job wasn't to achieve victory at any cost. It was to inflict maximum damage on the enemy while preserving his own force for continued operations. 8 Stukas attacking a lone bomber should have been overwhelming advantage, but when 5 aircraft were lost or damaged in the first 3 minutes, the mathematics shifted decisively. continuing the attack with 2 remaining aircraft against the defender who had already demonstrated unexpected capability would have been pride, not tactics. The formation leader chose survival, chose to fight again another day, made the decision that kept him alive long enough to eventually become a statistic. In late 1943, Juan Gisla finally ran out over the Eastern Front. The Stuka pilots who survived this engagement would have filed their mission reports, would have described the encounter in the evening discussions that happened in every combat squadron, would have passed along the information that separated bombers might not be easy prey anymore. The defensive capabilities had evolved in ways that weren't captured in intelligence brief. This information flow matters. It's how tactical knowledge spreads through military forces. Official intelligence channels document the known and verified. Informal pilot networks spread the experiential and suspected. The combination shapes how future engagements develop. If you have your own story about tactical adaptation in combat, or if your family has connections to this history, share it in the comments below. These personal accounts keep history alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into untold chapters of history. The broader context of bomber defense. By mid-1943, the entire concept of strategic bombing was being tested against the reality of German air defenses. The theory that massed formations of heavily armed bombers could fight their way to targets in daylight without fighter escort was proving costly. The loss rates were unsustainable in the long term. The training pipeline could barely keep up with casualties. Bomber production was adequate, but not unlimited. Every loss represented not just the aircraft, but the crewed and trained specialists whose replacement required months of training and years of institutional experience. The tactical evolution was continuous. Formation tactics changed, defensive armament improved, fighter escort capabilities expanded, electronic countermeasures were developed. Each change came from combat experience, showing where the vulnerabilities existed. But underlying all the technical and tactical evolution was a fundamental truth. At some point in every bombing mission, bombers were vulnerable. Formation discipline could only be maintained for so long. Aircraft took damage, crews made mistakes, mechanical failures happened, and when a bomber became separated from its formation, it became prey. The standard defensive doctrine maintained position, maintained fire discipline, trust the formation worked as long as you stayed in formation. But what happened when that became impossible? When damage or fuel or mechanical failure forced you out of the protective envelope? The official answer was that you did your best and hoped for fighter escort or that enemy fighters wouldn't find you. The waist gunner's improvisation suggested another answer. You changed the rules. You identified the constraints that made you vulnerable in this case. Limited fields of fire from interior gun positions, and you eliminated those constraints even if doing so created new risks. This philosophy of problem-solving through unconventional methods wasn't unique to one gunner or one aircraft. It was happening throughout the bomber force. Pilots were developing techniques for flying damaged aircraft that the flight manual said were navigators were finding routes through weather that meteorological theory said were impossible. Engineers were field-modifying equipment to solve problems that the design engineers hadn't anticipated. The cumulative effect was a force that became harder to kill. Not invulnerable losses remained high throughout 1943, but progressively more difficult to engage with acceptable risk-to-reward ratios from the German perspective. The Luftwaffe fighter forces were experiencing their own evil. New tactics for engaging bomber formations, new weapons systems, rockets, heavy cannons designed specifically for bomber destruction. New training programs emphasizing the specific techniques needed to crack open defensive formations. But they were also experiencing attrition, pilot losses, fuel shortages, maintenance challenges as aircraft aged and spare parts became scarce. The cumulative strain of fighting a defensive war against an enemy with seemingly unlimited resources. This strategic bombing campaign was, at its core, a mutual attrition contest. Which side could sustain losses longer? Which side could adapt faster? Which side would break first under the sustained pressure? The engineering reality after the war. When engineers and historians had time to analyze the BS-17's design in detail, certain truths became apparent. The defensive armament, while extensive by 1942 standards, had fundamental limitations that no amount of incremental improvement could fully address. The gun positions were optimized for formation aircraft with overlapping fields of fire, creating a defensive box that made penetration costly, but a single aircraft alone had geometric blind spots that were exploitable by skilled attackers. The waist gun positions specifically were compromises. They needed to provide defensive coverage while not compromising the structural integrity of the fuselage. They needed to allow ammunition, storage, and feed mechanisms. They needed to accommodate the gunner while leaving room for equipment and crew movement. These requirements created constraints on traverse and elevation that were inherent to the design. Alternative designs existed. The B-24 Liberator had different gun position layouts. British heavy bombers used different defensive philosophies, entirely often favoring speed and altitude over heavy armament. Each approach had advantages and disadvantages. Each represented different engineering trade-offs.